Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail. Today we're going to share Wendigo horror stories. First story, Wendigo stories. When I was young, I often spent parts of summers with my grandmother in her home out in the country. It was my favorite place in the world, and I always looked forward to the week-long stays of gardening, baking, late-night fires with s'mores and ghost stories, and enjoying having my grandmother all to myself. There was a pond not far from her house where I would sometimes go to swim. It was home to quite a few frogs, and at night they made the most incessant noises. I complained to my grandmother only once, saying I couldn't enjoy the night breeze with all that racket. She took me on her lap and told me a story about an old man and woman who lived near a lake. The old man couldn't stand the singing of the frogs, but his wife told him that they kept the Wendigo away, and to harm them would be unwise. Well, he didn't listen and set about methodically catching all the frogs on the lake. It was a process that took some time, but he did not stop until he had rid the lake of the pesky amphibians. That night, without the protection of the frogs, he and his wife were slaughtered by the Wendigo, a vicious, whip-like demon creature with elongated fingers ending in razor-sharp talons, and rows of silver teeth as thin and keen as needles. I wrote it off as another of her ghost stories, though she seemed more serious than usual about it. I never complained about the frogs again, mostly because I grew to enjoy them and put the story out of my mind. In fact, I'd forgotten all about it until it came up this past spring in a Native American literature class I was taking in college. The mention of the Wendigo sparked that old memory of my grandmother's story. I thought she had made up the word. I didn't realize there were stories about it, originating in Algonquian legends. Eager to connect something from my childhood to the topic, I Googled it, only to find that my grandmother had apparently been mistaken. There was nothing I could find about the story she had told me, nor any references of frogs providing protection from the Wendigo. In fact, the Wendigo of legends seemed very little like my grandmother's version. They were said to be insatiable, craving human flesh, and sometimes created from the forms of people who had resorted to cannibalism to survive. Descriptions varied, but they sounded almost nothing like my grandmother's bogeyman version. I actually chucked as I read it, almost a bit embarrassed by how badly my grandmother had messed up the original tale. I changed residences this summer, moving to a newly built 1,000 square foot on each side, duplex on the edge of town. The other side is to be occupied by my landlady, who'd had the place built. However, she isn't scheduled to move the rest of her stuff in and begin living there for a couple of weeks. She's waiting for her lease to end. Even though my new place is only a few minutes from the edge of town, it feels much more isolated. I enjoy the seclusion of my new home and its proximity to a more natural setting. I'm surrounded by woods, and from my patio, I can even see a pond beyond the carefully landscaped lawn, which is meticulously carved out from the surrounding woodlands. Just like the pond near my grandmother's house, the frogs have put up a ferocious racket lately. I prefer not to pay to run my air conditioning if I can help it, so I have every window open to catch a breeze. That means that I can hear them as clearly as if I were standing on the water's edge. It took a few days to get used to the noise, but I'm fine now, just like I was those summers when I was young. In fact, the noise has been comforting to me during the stress of the move. Tonight is different. I find myself standing in my living room, staring at where the pond is, though I can't see it in the dark. The air is eerily still and oppressively warm, but all my windows are shut, and I feel impossibly cold. I'd long since convinced myself that my grandmother's story had been a silly tale, a twisting of an old legend by irreverent storytellers. But for some reason, I have a most overwhelming sense of dread growing in the pit of my stomach. I don't know what to do. I'm trapped. Leaving my house means braving the darkness beyond my home, but I don't know if I'm going to be safe in here either. The frogs have stopped singing. Second story. I found a hole in the woods, and God whispered to me from its depths. I heard about the massacre at the old mill while buying supplies in Heidelberg. 2 pops, that's all I'd heard last night. sharp and distant like a car backfiring. Could have been gunshots. The housewives at Miller's General whispered over their canned peaches about how the police raided that Brides of Christendom compound up north. Found things. Bad things. Most of the women were killed in the firefight. My eyes caught the newspaper rack. Thought about buying one. Didn't. World's wicked enough without paying to read about it. The truck protested when I turned the key, coughing twice before the engine caught. I sat there, hands on the wheel, remembering what Pastor Weber said about God's justice being beyond mortal understanding. The small bag of hard candies for Hannah burned a hole in my pocket. Sugar rots both teeth and discipline, but a father provides. Those brides weren't right. Everyone knew it. They drift through town in those white dresses with faces blank as china dolls, passing out pamphlets about salvation. Couldn't tell you anything concrete about what they believed in, or about the young women who joined and were never seen again. Not right at all. But murder is murder, police raid or not. The Sixth Commandment makes no exceptions. I decided I'd pray for them tonight. The drive home took me deeper into the Schwarzwald, where the roads twist like black ribbons through ancient pines. Few people come this far into the mountains. Sometimes hikers stumble across my property, straying from the Hexenweg Trail that runs 3 kilometers east. They never stay long. Something about this part of the forest makes folks uneasy. The way the trees grow too close together, how the sunlight struggles to reach the forest floor even at midday. My cabin sits in a natural hollow, half hidden by the landscape. Built it myself 10 years ago, when Hannah was still small enough to carry. No electricity, no phone line. Just rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a steep roof to shed the heavy mountain snows. Root cellar keeps our food from spoiling, and the stream running behind never freezes, even in the depths of winter. It's not much, but it's what the Lord provides. It's a hard place for a child. I see that in how Hannah watches the hiking families that pass by, their children bright with store-bought clothes and easy laughter. Sometimes she stands at the window long after they've gone, fingers pressed against the glass like she's trying to hold onto their echo. But hardship builds character, and comfort breeds sin. Hannah was waiting on the porch when I pulled up, a scarecrow figure in her hand-me-down dress. She watched me unload without offering to help, thin arms wrapped around herself against the cold. That's how she is, quiet, watchful. The doctors in town called it developmental delays, but I know better. The Lord made her exactly as she needed to be. We ate our dinner in silence, venison stew and harbread. The kerosene lamp threw our shadows long against the wall, making the crucifixes dance. Hannah's eyes kept darting to the windows, now black with night. Her spoon scraped against ceramic in that way that usually earned her a stern look. Tonight, I let it pass. The woods have been strange lately. Not wrong, exactly. God's creation can never be wrong, but different, like the forest was holding its breath. The deer had grown scarce, birds quieter. Even the wind moved differently through the trees, making sounds that sometimes seemed almost like words. I'd lived in these woods long enough to know their moods. Sometimes the ancient places of the world grow heavy with his presence. These deep woods are closer to God, raw and untamed as the day he made them. The settled folks in town don't understand this. They've wrapped themselves in electric lights and television static, distancing themselves from his touch. But out here, you feel the weight of creation. Some days it presses down harder than others. The first scream came just after sunset. It was distant, could have been an animal, but something about it raised the hair on my neck. Hannah's spoon clattered against her bowl. "Papa," she whispered, and her voice had that same high pitch it got when she was 7 and found a dead fox in the yard, its belly split open and steaming in the winter air. "What was that?" "Could be nothing," I said, but my hand was already moving toward the rifle above the fireplace. We waited, breaths held. Then again, distant and high-pitched. This time, it almost sounded like laughter. I took down the hunting rifle, checking the chamber out of habit. Keep my weapons clean as scripture demand a man keep his soul. Stay inside. Lock the door behind me. Papa, please. Her voice cracked. She grabbed my sleeve with both hands, something she hadn't done since she was very small. There's something wicked out there. I frowned down at her. How do you know? I feel it, she insisted, her tugs becoming more urgent. Like when you know a storm's coming before you see the clouds. God is warning me deep in my tummy. If what you say is true, I replied, gently pulling free of her grip. Then who better to protect his realm than his most devoted servant? She had nothing to say to that. Truth has a way of silencing doubt. The night air struck like a hammer of ice. Moonlight turned the forest silver white, each tree casting a prison bar shadow across frozen ground. My breath came in clouds as I moved between the pines, rifle ready. The woods were different at night. Every shadow deeper, every sound magnified. Another cry echoed through the trees, closer now. Could have been wind through the valleys, but wind doesn't sob like that. Through the trees, something white flickered, maybe cloth catching moonlight. But there shouldn't be anything out here. We're miles from the nearest neighbor. I know every inch of these was like I know my prayers. I moved closer, boots crunching on frozen leaves. More movement ahead, quick darting. My flashlight beam caught nothing but trees and shadows. But the ground told a different story. Bare footprints in the frost, small and precise like a dancer's. And something else, dark spots in the snow that could have been blood. Hello. My voice sounded thin in the vast silence. This is private property. The woods went dead quiet. Not even wind in the trees. Just the sound of my own breathing, harsh in the stillness. My flashlight caught something hanging from a branch. A scrap of white fabric, edge stained dark. I picked it up, turned it over in my hand. Old, smelled of pine needles, and something else, sweet decay like overripe fruit. When I reached the cabin, Hannah was standing on the porch. The kerosene lamp behind her cast her shadow long and narrow across the snow, like a crack in the earth. "Did you shoot them, Papa?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "Did you shoot the witches?" The question hit like a slap. "What did you say?" Hannah shifted on her feet, looking down at her bare toes, turning blue in the cold. A suspicion crossed my mind. "Did you read the newspaper when it was delivered this morning?" The words came out sharp as icicles. "You know what I've told you about throwing them away? About not filling your head with that sort of thing." Hannah merely shifted on her feet, looking down at her bare toes. Disapproval pooled hot in my belly. Lord, forgive the child her disobedience. That night, as we knelt for evening prayer, Hannah's hands tightened in mine as we recited the Lord's Prayer together. "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." Her fingers felt like ice in my grip. Behind us, the windows rattled in a sudden gust of wind, and I could have sworn I heard laughter carried on the breeze, high and wild, like breaking glass. The next day passed as most do. After breakfast, hard bread and the last of our preserved applesauce, we began Hannah's lessons. She has a quick mind when she chooses to apply it, though she's been more distant lately. Still, she worked through her multiplication tables without complaint, recited her verses from Proverbs, and copied passages from the few history books I allow in the house. Around midday, Hannah went to tend to those goats she's so fond of. Strange creatures, they appeared during the first frost of winter, drawn perhaps by the smoke from our chimney or the scraps Hannah sometimes leaves out. 3 of them, all identical with rough black coats and bright eyes. They produce no milk, bear no kids, but Hannah doted on them. I let her keep them against my better judgment. They didn't need much feed, preferred the sparse grass and foliage during the warmer months, and displayed a surprising level of fortitude during winter. I'd done a fool thing a few years back and slaughtered a brace of rabbits Hannah had hand-raised since they were kittens. She didn't speak to me for months, so I let her keep the goats, lest I risk her wrath once again. I prayed God would forgive me this one indulgent for my little girl. What better to love than one of God's creatures? The rest of the day we spent on chores, splitting wood, checking the snares, preserving what little game they'd caught. We ate our dinner in familiar silence, the wind whispering through the gaps in the logs. That night, something woke me. Perhaps a sound, perhaps just the weight of another's gaze upon my face. I opened my eyes to find a woman staring through my window. The moon lit her face silver bright. She was smiling. No, her face was split by a smile, stretched impossibly wide across features that seemed to shift and flow like candle wax. Her eyes were dark hollows, reflecting nothing. Not quite human, but wearing humanity like an ill-fitting mask. I reached for my rifle, never taking my eyes off her. When I looked back, she was gone, but I caught a flash of white disappearing into the trees. Without thinking, I pulled on my boots and coat. The rifle was loaded. I always keep it loaded these days. Hannah stirred in her bed across the room. "Go back to sleep," I whispered. "Papa needs to check something." The night air bit deep. That laughter came again, high and wild, like breaking glass. There, another glimpse of white between the black trunks of the pines. I followed, my boots crunching in the fresh snow. She vanished into the darkness ahead, leaving no footprints I could see. I was about to turn back when I heard it, a strange huffing sound like an animal digging. Following the noise, I pushed through a thicket of young pines into a small clearing. There she was, illuminated by moonlight, on her hands and knees, clawing at the frozen earth like a mad thing. Her white dress was filthy now, torn and stained with soil. As she dug, she made a sound that raised the hair on my neck, a keening mixture of giggles and pants, rhythmic and desperate. Not human, not quite. I raised my rifle. The sound of the bolt cycling made her head snap up, and for a moment our eyes met. Then she bolted, moving with that same unnatural speed I'd seen before, vanishing between the trees like smoke. I took a step to follow, then stopped. Something was wrong. The air had grown thick, heavy with a presence I could feel pressing against my back like a physical weight. Slowly, I turned around. The hole drew me forward. I didn't want to approach it. Everything in me screamed to run, but my feet moved of their own accord. As I drew closer, I saw the ground around it was scored with deep scratches. Dozens of fingernail marks in the frozen earth, overlapping each other. Multiple sets of hands had dug this, tearing through soil and frost with bare fingers. I knew I shouldn't look, knew it like I know my prayers. But I found myself leaning forward, peering into that absolute darkness. Something looked back, hidden and hungry. It reached up through that hole and touched me, not with hands or claws, but with a presence that turned my bowels to water and my legs to jelly. I soiled myself like a child, scrambling backward, my mind unable to process what I'd felt. The weight of judgment, but not God's judgment. Something older, something that had been waiting. I ran until my lungs burned and branches whipped my face bloody. Ran until I burst through our cabin door, waking Hannah with my panicked entrance. "Papa." Her voice was small, frightened. "What's wrong? What happened?" I seized her hands, pulled her from her bed. "Pray with me," I demanded. "Pray until sunrise." "Papa, you're hurting me. Pray." We knelt there on the rough wooden floor, my hands gripping hers too tightly as I recited prayer after prayer. Hannah tried to ask questions, but I shushed her harshly. This was more important. With each passing hour, as gray dawn crept closer, understanding bloomed in my mind like a revelation. The white robe that woman in the woods was wearing. I'd recognized it. The same white dress those brides of Christendom wore. The massacre at their compound hadn't been senseless violence after all. It had been divine intervention. Those women, those things, they had been planning something. Digging something up that should have stayed buried. But the police, for all their guns and authority, had failed. Evil still lurked in these woods, scratching at the earth with bloody fingers. That's why God had shown me the truth. Me, who had rejected the modern world's comforts and temptations. Me, who had raised my child in righteous solitude, unwavering in my faith while others grew soft and complacent. I alone had been chosen to finish what the authorities had started. I alone had the strength, the purity of spirit to face this evil. My years of devotion had led to this moment, this divine purpose. "Papa," Hannah whispered as the first light touched our windows. "You're crying." I touched my cheek, felt wetness there, star. "Tears of joy." Asterisk, I assured her. "It gets fuzzy after that." Days bled into one another after that night. I tried to keep them clear in my head, but my thoughts were muddled, my mind consumed with this one task I now held above all else. Hannah's lessons went untaught, the snares unchecked. A necessary sacrifice, I knew that. With time, she would understand. Greater things were at play. Terrible consequences to be had were I not to follow through with my purpose. I spent my days lost in Scripture, finding echoes of myself in Moses and Elijah. At night, I would prowl through the obsidian forest, listening for fingers scratching against frozen earth or that gurgling, hitching laughter. I'd only return when dawn threatened the horizon, certain, somehow, that this evil was a creature of darkness. Time meant nothing. How could it, when I stood on the cusp of such glory? I'd hear Hannah in the morning, stoking the fire, stretching our meager supplies into something like breakfast. Her movements grew slower each day, her frame more fragile, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying that night's vision, seeing that terrible hole in every shadow, every dark corner. "Papa, we need food," she'd say, her voice getting smaller, more careful with each passing day. She held up our last jar of preserves like it was evidence at a trial. The root cellar's almost empty. "God provides for his chosen ones," I'd reply, running my hand along my rifle's barrel for the 100th time that hour. Remember how he fed the Israelites in the desert? Trust in his providence. And wasn't I proved right when Hannah would return from her daily wanderings, apron heavy with blackberries, dirty hands cupping pale mushrooms like offerings? "See how he provides," I'd tell her, though she'd just stare at me with those huge, hollow eyes. "See," I would tell her, "see how he provides for us?" By the end of the first week, sleep became a distant memory. Each night, I'd pace our small cabin, muttering prayers and checking my rifle, waiting for darkness to fall so I could resume my sacred hunt. Sometimes I caught Hannah watching me, her face gaunt in the lamplight. The weight of her silence felt like judgment, and that judgment kindled something hot and dangerous in my chest. One night, deep in the woods and parched from hours of searching, I stopped to drink from a still pond. Moonlight turned the water's surface to mirror glass. As I bent to drink, I saw them, great wings of silver white spreading from my shoulders, shimmering with holy purpose. I was transfigured, become an angel of judgment. The vision filled me with righteous fire. I spent hours at my prayers now, my voice growing hoarse as I thanked God for choosing me, for showing me his divine purpose. Hannah would kneel beside me, trembling with what I took for religious fervor, though now I wonder if it was simply hunger or fear. "Papa," she said one morning, her small hands clutching at my sleeve like a drowning person grabbing for rope, "the goats are acting strange. They followed you last night. I saw them from the window." "Of course they did," I replied, stroking her hair with magnanimous affection. "I am their shepherd, as Christ is mine. Did he not say my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me? But there's something wrong with them. They're not normal. They haven't eaten in weeks, we've no grass, but they're growing all fat." I silenced her with a kiss atop her head, though her high-pitched voice had begun to grate like fingernails on slate. "I'll be back before dawn," I promised her, and left. The goats accompanied me most nights now, their black forms moving like shadows between the trees. Sometimes I would preach to them as we walked, explaining my holy mission. They would listen with tilted heads, their rectangular pupils reflecting the moonlight like tiny golden crosses. 10 days in, I stopped reading scripture altogether. What need had I for ancient words when God spoke to me directly now? I could feel his presence in every rustle of wind through the pines, every crunch of snow beneath my boots. The woods themselves seemed to whisper their approval of my quest. Hannah grew more insistent, more troublesome. One morning, I found her try to pack a bag with our few remaining possessions. "What are you doing?" I demanded. "We need help, Papa," she whispered. "You're not well. Pastor Weber would understand." I struck the bag from her hands, sending our last precious cup of flour spilling across the floor. Pastor Weber is a blind fool who coddles his flock with soft words and softer doctrine. God has chosen me for this task, me alone. She flinched away from my rage, and something in her retreat sent a thrill through me. Yes, fear was appropriate. Respect. Long had it been absent. 2 weeks slid by like shadows on a sundial, slow and steady, each night punctuated by the same ritual. Hannah and I knelt together in prayer, her voice a timid echo of my own as we sought meaning, affirmation, proof that my faith was not only righteous but ordained. My faith was the kind of faith that burned, fierce and hot, devouring any doubts before they had time to fester. But tonight something shifted. She opened the Bible, my Bible, without so much as a glance for permission. Her fingers trembled, but her voice held a strange steeliness. Proverbs 16, verse 18, she said, the words tight in her throat like they didn't want to come out. Then she read them aloud. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. I stared at her. It took a few long seconds for the weight of the verse to press down like a stone balanced on my chest. "Is there something you want to say, Hannah?" My voice was calm, almost gentle. Too calm. Her eyes met mine, unflinching. Hard. Older than they had any right to be. "I miss you, Papa," she whispered. "I fear for your soul." The words hit like a gut punch. For the first time in weeks, months, maybe, I felt it doubt. It slid into me like a slick, oily serpent, winding its way through the cracks of my certainty. And then came the rage. Hot, sharp, and purifying. I snatched the Bible from her hands, the leather binding creaking in protest. "How dare you?" I heard myself say, as though from some great distance. "You think you know better than me? Better than him? I have been chosen, Hannah. Chosen. I have seen his glory with my own eyes. And you dare to question me?" Her lip trembled. "You haven't been chosen," she cried, her voice pitching with childlike terror. "You're arrogant and vain and mean, and I hate you." I erupted to my feet, hand raised to strike her, but she was already moving. She bolted for the door, her bare feet slapping against the wooden floorboards. "Hannah!" I shouted, but she didn't stop. The door slammed behind her. I lunged for the handle only to hear the scrape of wood. She was wedging something under the knob from outside. For a moment, just a moment, I stood there, panting, hand frozen midair. On the other side of the door, I could hear her breathing, quick and shallow. Fearful. "I'll do it myself," she screamed through the door, her voice cracking with terror and determination. "Whatever's out there, I'll be the one to stop it. Then you'll have nothing left." "Hannah." I slammed my palm against the door. When she didn't answer, I forced my voice calmer. "Hannah, let me out." I heard her breathing hitch on the other side. "You'll be okay," she said. "You'll come back once it's done." "Hannah." Terror laced through my veins like ice. She couldn't. It was my destiny, my duty. I hauled back and kicked the door, my leg jarring against solid oak. I heard her sharp cry, her receding footsteps, toward the woods, off to steal what was rightfully mine. The axe leaned in its place by the fireplace, its handle smooth from years of use. I took it in hand, its weight steadying me. She had no right. None. No child could understand the burden I carried, the divine purpose that coursed through my veins like fire. I swung. The first blow sent cracks spidering through the wood. The second showered splinters across the floor. Through the jagged hole, I saw her, a ghostly blur in her white nightgown, vanishing into the tree lane. Through the jagged remains, I saw her. Her white nightgown was a ghostly blur, vanishing into the line of trees beyond the yard. She moved fast, faster than I thought she could, but I was faster. The axe fell from my fingers. I reached for the rifle above the mantel instead. A shepherd crook for a shepherd's duty. I wouldn't let her define me. Not like this. The cold bit in my lungs as I hurtled through the night, breath steaming, the rifle steady in my hands. The trees swallowed her up, but I could hear her, branches snapping, undergrowth rustling. Each crack of a twig was like a beacon calling me onward. Behind me came another sound familiar. The goats were following, their hooves striking the frozen ground with a deliberate rhythm. Not just footsteps, a cadence, a beat that matched my pulse. Their soft, bleating rose, but it wasn't the plaintive call of livestock. It sounded like laughter, low and mocking, as if they understood more than they should. Their soft, bleating rose, but it wasn't the plaintive call of livestock. No, it was something else entirely. It sounded almost like laughter, low and mocking, as if they understood more than they should. Ahead, the moonlight spilled through the canopy, and I swore I saw it. The glimmer of her nightgown, the flash of her small, pale face. She wouldn't get far. Not for me. My angel wings, his angel wings, spread wide, their shadows stretching across the frostbitten ground. The forest loomed, dark and waiting, as I chased my wayward lamb into its depths. And then I saw her. Hannah knelt in a clearing, her nightgown stark against the black earth. Her hands clawed at the frozen ground, raw and bloodied as she scraped at the edges of that blessed chasm. Somehow, she had found it, as though it had been waiting ready all this time. My chasm, my purpose, the culmination of everything I had sacrificed. Stop! The word ripped from my throat, and I leveled the rifle at her narrow back. She froze, her trembling frame caught in the silver light of the moon. This isn't for you, I said, stepping closer. It's mine. This was meant for me. She didn't turn around. Her voice, when it came, was small. Papa, I can feel it. The wrongness. It's in the air. It's in you. The rifle rose, the weight of it steady in my grip. I pointed it at her, and my daughter, my lamb, turned defiant wolf. Step away from the hole. Now. She stood slowly, her small figure pale and fragile in the moonlight. The snow clung to her nightgown, turning it to rags, but she didn't shiver. Behind her, the goats gathered, their burning eyes locked on me. Their mouths hung open, jowls pulled back from stained yellow teeth in strange grins. I edged closer, the rifle trained on Hannah's heart. The chasm yawned before me, its edges jagged and dark, the void within pulsing like a hungry, open mouth. From its depths came a whisper, low and syrupy, coiling around my mind. How big and juicy you've gotten, it said. How fat and swollen. Are you here to stop me, Thomas? Yes. I panted, heart thudding in my chest. As only I can. But of course, the voice crooned. Nobody is as strong as you. Nobody as smart or as devoted. This is why God chose you. I couldn't help it. The words were a balm to my cracked soul, sweeter than honey. Yes, I whispered, the rifle trembling in my hands. Yes, that's right. How proud you must be. And I was. Pride swelled inside of me, so much of it I felt like I might burst. A cry tore from my throat as a weight struck my back. Hannah's small body slammed into me with all the force she could muster, and I stumbled, my boots skidding on the loose earth at the edge of the chasm. I teetered there, the rifle slipping from my grasp as my boots lost purchase, the brittle edge crumbling beneath me. For one awful moment, I was weightless, plunging into the scorching maw of the void, but my hand shot out, snagging the rim just before I disappeared entirely. My fingers dug into the frozen earth, nails splintering as the ground shifted under my grip. Below me, the abyss boiled with unnatural heat, a blistering force that pressed against my skin, alive and ravenous, dragging at me as though it had been waiting for this moment. "Hannah," my voice cracked. "Help me, please. I'm your father." She stood over me, silhouetted by the moonlight, her face streaked with tears that gleamed like silver as they froze on her cheeks. "You taught me to listen to God's voice," she said, her words faltering but resolute. "But you stopped listening a long time ago." "Hannah," my grip was failing, the earth crumbling beneath my fingers. She lowered her head, her voice trembling as she spoke our prayer. "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." I choked on my breath, the weight of my own words thrown back at me. "You're wrong. You're wrong." My voice rose to a scream. "I am your father. I am chosen. I am." Her foot came down on my fingers. The pain was white-hot, a searing betrayal. My grip gave way, and I plunged into the darkness. As I fell, the last thing I saw were the goats, silhouetted by the moon, peering over the edge at me, and Hannah, my lamb, standing tall as she watched me go. My final thought was bitter and sharp, cutting through the blackness. At least I felt like Lucifer, defiant, proud, until the end. Third story. My girlfriend is terrified of deer. I didn't believe her until it was too late. I live in the woods, but not the way most people mean it when they say I live in the woods. I don't just have a bunch of trees in my backyard. I live on about 10 acres of woodland near a local nature center in a house my grandfather willed me a few years ago. It's an area I've lived in and around for most of my life, so I'm used to the quirks that come with it. Mostly the wildlife and bad cell reception, but sometimes down trees or snake infestations. My girlfriend Annie is what a lot of people around here would call a city slicker. She lives half an hour away in the closest college town, has an internship at a publishing company, and drives an electric car. We met through some mutual friends who go to the same college, and she doesn't have a problem with driving out to visit me, so we see each other a few times a week. She's a good sport about the bad cell reception, too, and the insects that are constantly trying to get into the house. She doesn't even mind the truck I drive that's older than me, or the suggestion of there being snakes around. In fact, there's only one thing on my property Annie has a problem with, and I didn't notice it until a few months ago. She was driving me back to my place after we'd gone out for dinner and a movie, and it was dark out, the kind of pitch dark it can only really get in the woods. The high beams of her car lit up my gravel driveway as she turned off onto it, lighting up the corridor of trees around us as brightly as if it was still daytime. Annie hummed along and bobbed her head to the radio, and I leaned back in my seat, checking whatever text messages I could before my cell service took a dive. Suddenly, Annie slammed the brakes. I looked up sharply to see if we had reached the house, or if an animal had run across the road, but there was nothing out there, just more gravel road. I looked to Annie for some kind of explanation, only to find her recoiling from the windshield with an expression as though she'd just seen a big, fat spider skittering across the kitchen floor. Her gaze was locked on something just to the side of the road, and I followed her line of sight to a spot where the high beams were reflecting off of a handful of wide, glowing eyes like glass marbles. A couple of does, and what looked like a young buck, just starting to grow antlers. "They're not going to cross," I said, thinking that Annie was afraid of hitting them. "I know," she said. "So what?" I said, "You're afraid you're going to catch Lyme's disease?" "I'm just afraid of them," Annie said, setting her jaw stubbornly. "I'm ashamed to admit it now, but I might have laughed." "They're just deer," I said, leaning across her to smack the center of her steering wheel. The car horn sounded in a sudden blast of noise, and the deer scattered back into the woods. "I know they're just deer," Annie said, very clearly annoyed with me. There wasn't any chance of her spending the night at my place, and I'm still afraid of them. I don't like the way they watch me. She said it like she knew it was silly, and I was tempted to make fun of her a little more, or to tell her a couple of stories from experience of just how stupid deer could be, to reassure her that there wasn't much of anything going on behind those reflective eyes of theirs. But part of me could sense that Annie was genuinely freaked out, and I should just leave it alone. Besides, people have all kinds of weird phobias. Being afraid of deer was probably nothing compared to some of those. I put Annie's phobia out of mind, except for the few times she drove me home and I watched her anxiously checking the darkness around my house for deer, recoiling the same way she had that first night whenever she spotted any. Watching her watch the deer made me begin to realize that I had no idea how large the deer population on my property really was. During the day, I would occasionally see groups of 9 or 10 deer grazing on grass at the edge of the tree line near my back porch. Deer of all shapes and sizes, from huge bucks to the tiniest fawns that looked as though they'd just been born. I started trying to keep track of them to see if it was the same group every time or different families, but it was hard work. A lot of deer look exactly the same. Even in spite of realizing exactly how many deer lived on my property, I didn't think of them as a problem until the hunter showed up on my doorstep. He drove a truck bigger than mine, a hulking, white thing with an American flag decal plastered all along one side of it, and said he and his buddies had been asked by the nature center to cull their deer population. My property butted right up against theirs, so he offered to send a few guys my way to clear out the woods around my house. "You're culling the deer?" I asked, sounding maybe a little more outraged than I should have been. "What? Just cutting down the population," he said, giving me a look like I had no idea what I was talking about. It made me like him less. To be fair, I didn't know what I was talking about in this particular instance, but I'm not fond of that look. It's a look I get a lot, being a woman who lives alone in the woods. "What?" I asked again. Surely there weren't that many deer in the woods. "Overpopulation," the hunter said, still giving me that look like I was asking questions I should already have known the answer to. "Too many deer at the center. Screws up the ecosystem. More chance of people getting Lyme over there, too. And eventually, the deer will run out of food and starve." When he put it like that, I got the idea that this was a lot kinder towards the deer than the alternative. I could probably deal with seeing less fawns in my yard if it meant the ones still around had plenty to eat. And less deer meant less for Annie to be afraid of on the nights she came over. "All right," I said with a curt nod. "You can sweep my property, too." "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," the hunter said. "Our deal with the nature center is we get to keep whatever we kill. Now, you're free to pay extra if you want the meat dash." "That's okay," I said quickly. I thanked him for the offer, then, and retreated back into my house as he walked back towards his truck. I found out from a friend who worked at the nature center that the culling was scheduled to take place early the next morning, practically before the sun came up. I slept with headphones in that night, intent on ignoring any gunshots that came out of the woods behind my house, if there were any to begin with. Did most hunters still use bows? I'd only been hunting a few times with my grandpa when I was in high school, but I remembered being taught to use a bow. Despite the headphones, I woke up close to the crack of dawn like I usually did when the sun started to pour in from the window next to my bed. I don't go to school, and I have an IT job that lets me work remotely from my laptop, but there's always house chores that need doing, and I like to get them out of the way in the mornings. I was putting out food on the porch for the stray cats that like to come around when I saw it. A trail of fresh blood in the grass right near the tree line, and a deer crawling its way across the ground, all the way down on its belly like a scared dog. I'd never seen a deer crawl like that before. There was something unnatural about it, something that made me wonder if it was rabid. Judging from the blood trail, it was at least wounded. I stepped back into the house and grabbed my grandpa's shotgun out of the garage. It was old, and I wasn't sure it had ever actually been used. My grandpa had told me it was more for scaring off trespassers than anything. Still, there were a few boxes of shells in the garage, and I loaded the gun with buckshot before taking it outside with me. The deer I'd seen before had vanished, leaving only the trail of blood behind it. I steadied my hands on the barrel of the shotgun, my fingers feeling a little frozen in the early morning cold, and walked into the woods as quietly as I could, mindful that any twig I snapped underfoot would likely send any deer, even a hurt or rabid one, running. I've been in the woods around my property before, but not often, and following the blood trail led me deeper inside than I'd ever been before. It was strangely quiet back there, except for the occasional rustling of foliage, and the canopy of trees blotted out the sun in a way that left me perpetually in the shade. The blood trail on the ground never dried up, though. In fact, it got wider and wetter as I continued to follow it. I was sure that any moment I would come upon a deer that had been half eviscerated and somehow crawled all the way back to where it thought it would be safe. What I actually found at the end of the blood trail was something worse. Something I still see painted on the backs of my eyelids at night, when I'm trying to clear my mind enough to fall asleep. The blood trail didn't belong to a deer. Rather, it ended close to a hollow in the trunk of a large tree that a man lay inside. At least I thought it was a man. I could only see his legs sticking out. A handful of deer stood over him, occasionally lowering their heads down to sniff or lick at the man, and several had mouths that were shiny with blood. I moved closer, cocking the shotgun. The noise startled the deer, and all of them bolted but one, a large doe who stayed right where she was, watching me. A glistening rope dangled from her mouth that I thought might have been part of a hunter's trap, but later realized was a bit of intestine. I took a few more steps forward, watching the doe watch me, until I stood over the hollow in the tree. The man inside was the hunter I'd met the previous day. His bright orange coat was soaked with blood, his chest and abdomen bitten open in more places than I could count, the skin torn away in lazy strips. His skin had turned a sickly gray, and there were strange, round wounds in his neck, like he'd been stuck with a stake or a screwdriver. Antler wounds, I realized, my stomach turning over. I reached out to lift his coat slightly with the end of the shotgun, and recoiled as I caught sight of his ribs through one of the holes the deer had bitten in him. A twig snapped next to me. The doe was still there, still looking at me with her big, glassy eyes, still munching on the rope of the hunter's intestines. I raised the shotgun and unloaded buckshot into her. That was a few days ago, and I haven't left the house since. I called the nature center to ask how the culling went, and they said that half the hunters who went into the woods never came back out. The police came by to ask if I'd seen or heard anything from my property, and I lied. Whoever heard of deer eating someone alive? I've been thinking, though, about what the hunter said to me when he came by, about how when there are too many deer on a property, they start to run out of food. Starve. I've heard before that a lot of herbivore animals will eat meat if they've run out of options. What I haven't heard about is animals like that doing it in a vengeful way, an intelligent way, not eating the nature center employees, but the hunters instead. I haven't seen the stray cats that live around here all week. The food I left out for them that morning hasn't been touched, but I have seen the deer. They've been circling my house all week, crawling on their bellies in the grass like the one that led me to the hunter. I can't help but feel like they know what I did to that doe somehow, like one of them saw me shoot her and pass the knowledge on. Like the deer think I'm a hunter, too. They haven't gotten up to the doors yet, but some of the bucks are on my back porch, looking into the windows. I drew all the curtains in the house, turned off all the lights, but I can still feel their eyes on me, right outside. It can't be long before they try to break the glass. I swear I've heard them tapping on it with their antlers, testing where the weak points are. I've peeked out of the second floor windows at night, trying to catch them at it, but all I ever see are their reflective eyes shining up at me out of the dark. Annie was right to be afraid. I'm sorry I doubted her. Fourth story. The time I saw a Wendigo. First things first, this happened to me when I was around 10. I've lived in Idaho all my life and spent a lot of time outside or in the wilderness as a kid. My grandparents would take me camping, and my older brother and I would always hike up whatever trails we could find to get a view of the sunset. On one of these occasions, something terrifying happened. We were up at a campsite I only know as Warm River, the river there never freezes over, and my brother and I were on a regular evening hike. There was an old tunnel bored through the mountain at one part of the trail, probably an old train tunnel, and we were walking through it when I heard something I'll never forget. After walking through probably 2/3 of the way through the tunnel, I heard a terrible screech at the end we entered through. The screech wasn't like anything I've heard before. I've heard the screams of animals on dark and windy nights, I even think I've heard Bigfoot calls a few times, but never the metallic, grinding screech I heard that day. The point is, whatever the sound was, it did not sound natural in any capacity. I probably jumped 5 feet in the air when I heard it, and my brother shouted a few choice curses before shooing me quickly to the exit of the tunnel. At this point, my brother decided we should just continue walking and head back after whatever made the noise hopefully cleared out. We didn't have any firearms on us, so I was pretty upset. My brother reassured me we would be fine, and we made the walk back without incident. However, I didn't get any sleep that night. Whether it was the thing that screeched at us or just my imagination, I heard things moving around the campsite the whole night, as well as whispers echoing through the darkness outside the trailer. I woke my brother up a few times to check out what it was, but he refused each time, telling me that it was probably just other campers staying up late and enjoying themselves. The rest of the trip was pretty normal. We packed up the following day, and my life continued as normal. I was disconcerted, but chalked what happened up as a harmless event that I must have been exaggerating in retrospect. A few weeks later, I went up to Pine Basin, an old ski lodge my family rented each year for family reunions. Here I would mess around with my cousins, our favorite activities being night games. We would play hide and seek, a game called Ghost in the Graveyard, and other games like that. On one instance, I was chosen to be the seeker for a hide and seek game. Because I was one of the younger cousin, I got a flashlight as an advantage. Normally, all the younger cousins hid close to the lodge, and the older cousins hid in the nearby trees or at the base of the nearby mountain. As I was searching near the bottom of the mountain, I heard a familiar whistle up the mountain a bit. We would always whistle as a hint at our locations. It sounded like someone was hiding way up near a tree known as the underwear tree. You can guess why. So I began trekking up toward the whistle. As I climbed closer, I got an uneasy feeling in my stomach. I continued on wearily and convinced myself that I would be fine. I hated walking in the night alone, but figured whoever I find would walk me back to the lodge. As I neared the tree, I noticed that it was deathly silent. This alerted me that something was very wrong, because you could always hear the adults having fun back at the lodge. I was anxious to hurry back, so I called out, "I found you, Scott." I thought the whistle was my older cousin's. "Come back down with me." I got no reply, but I wasn't planning on waiting. As I began walking back down the path, I heard a voice call, "You almost had me," so I ran back up to investigate. I flashed my light in the branches of the tree and saw a monstrosity that was not my cousin. It looked like a poorly drawn stick figure made into a human with its emaciated figure and lifeless eyes. I remember its face looked like the skin on its head was being pulled from behind. It had torn and stretched features. As soon as I saw the creature, I screamed, dropped the flashlight, and ran back to the lodge. The entire time I ran, I was overcome by an overpowering smell, and I could hear the thing running after me. As I approached the camp, I saw a few people, my cousins, at the bottom of the mountain waiting for me. I was crying and shaking, and they took me inside. I told my dad what happened, but my cousins all said they didn't see anything following me. The adults kept us inside for the night, and I kept hearing sounds drifting in from the mountains. I never played night games after that happened, and was always terrified that my cousins wouldn't listen to my warnings. Ever since that night, I have always felt uneasy up in those mountains. I used to be really religious, and figured it was a demon of some kind trying to kill me or something like that. But those mountains have never felt the same after that incident. A few years ago, the game, Until Dawn, became really popular, and I watched a walkthrough of it on YouTube. When the Wendigo first appeared in game, I got chills down my spine. It was exactly what I saw, and I did a ton of research on them. I figure someone must have gotten snowed in at that old lodge and resorted to cannibalism. But that doesn't explain what happened at Warm River. I still hear that screech from time to time. It never occurred to me until watching Until Dawn that they might be from the same thing, and it scares the hell out of me every time. I heard it earlier tonight, and that's why I decided to finally write my story down. Wish me luck. Fifth story. That's not a deer. A video has been going around recently of someone riding up on a lone deer. In their excitement, they greet it with a cheery, "Hello, deer." As it peers back over its shoulder at the caller, something seems off. This deer has an elongated neck. It stares intently at the person on the quad bike, sizing them up as their neck almost appears to grow longer and their fur becomes increasingly darker. As a viewer, I became unsettled. Feelings of the uncanny valley phenomenon washed over me like a tsunami, though not purely out of fear, out of recognition. If you recognize the term flesh pedestrian, I hope it is because of research and not an encounter such as mine. I was barely fortunate enough to survive the experience. I have always been fond of wildlife and the forest near my home, roughly a 10 to 15-minute walk from my house. I love taking my camera and photographing the birds, the fauna, and various fungi that inhabited the woodland around me. Sometimes there would even be the local deer herd grazing in the open field of the clearing or walking through the brush. As a few years went by watching these beautiful creatures on rare occasions, they would let me glimpse into their world. I took photos to hang in my home of does with their fawns, the alpha male stag with his horns in full glory, and even the young doe with a rare genetically mutated white coat. Though this one particular day's shooting, one of my photos was not as the rest appeared. One of the herd stood out, not because of its natural magnificence, but rather because of its repugnancy. In the sunlight stood your usual doe, her reddish-brown coat framing her eyes and ears, but the side where the sun didn't touch. My God, I wish I'd never taken that photo. Well, I should be saying its face had flesh hanging from its jawbone, as the meat seemed to have rotted away from its entire face. Its teeth were as yellow as its clearly weathered skull. There was no eye instead replaced by a hollowed-out socket with a haunting deep red glow. I felt bile rise in my stomach as chills shot up my spine like missiles telling my body to run. My usual 10-minute walk turned into a 3-minute sprint, the country lanes feeling more like death traps than freedom. Leaping the front garden fence, I fumble for my keys, opening the door before slamming it behind me. The feeling of eyes upon me made my skin burn. Peering out, if the kitchen window, every late evening shadow appeared as a creature from the setting sun. And there it was. Stood next to bushes at the end of the drive was that thing. Only this time it could barely pass for a deer. Its front hooves morphed into clawed hands. Its face hollowed and rotten, its corpse a mass of blackened, decaying flesh, and entrails kept in by a thin, near-transparent layer of skin. It stood on its hind legs before me, taking slow, calculated steps. It raises its leg and covered the front fence in one move. My mouth went dry as I watched, each step making my heart beat faster as it turned into some horrifying beast, the smell penetrating the door as if death itself had tried to claim the creature and failed. I gagged barely, keeping myself together as I moved away from window to hide behind the door, collapsing behind it as my legs gave way. Tears began to roll down my cheeks as its claws raked down the door. The creature let out a deafening squeal, almost as if a pig and a person were screaming through a siren at the same time. Then there was silence. The smell disappeared as quickly as it came. I waited until it had gotten completely dark before I stood up. I crept towards the kitchen window, staying low. I quietly pulled out the drawer, grasping for a knife. I don't know what for. I guess in hindsight, it was a comfort to have at least something to feel as though I could defend myself. As I stood to look outside, the solar lights illuminated the edges of the empty garden. Looking around, I could see nothing. Not the usual fox and her cubs rolling around the wild lawn, nor the owls that frequented the trees. I don't know what made me do it, but I went back to the door and opened it, taking a look outside in disbelief. How had this thing kept pace with me all the way home just to vanish without a trace? The next few days were uneventful. I barely ventured outside, too scared of what I might find, or what might find me. I took a walk early this morning, trying to take some photos of the wild rabbit among the golden brown leaves, some with their whiskers covered in dew, others fighting for territory or the nearest female's attention. The sun shone through the trees, as if an autumnal veil was being laid over their branches. I took a moment to breathe in the fresh, cool air and wonder to myself about the day ahead as I checked through my photos, till I noticed something in the background of each one. A deer. I'm writing all of this now as I'm trying to walk back to the clearing. I know it's behind me. I think there's another too. I keep looking over my shoulder, but each time I do, the smell is getting stronger and I see more deer. There are 4 currently stood on their hind legs with their front clawed hands wrapped around the trees, watching me with their red eyes, and I know I can't outrun them. I'm going to snap a few photos and start running, but if I don't make it home, I hope whoever finds my camera doesn't look at the horror I have captured. Sixth story. I have some stories to tell about my childhood growing up in the woods. Hello, everyone. My name is Kai, and I have some stories to tell about my childhood. If any of you would be interested, I've seen a lot of accounts within the past year about search and rescue, things that go on in the woods that most people wouldn't have heard about if they hadn't read it here. I thought maybe my point of view would be interesting, to say the least. See, I grew up in the forest, and there's stuff that happens outside your door than what can be monitored by officers. So I'll start off with my first memory, and then I'll decide if I should post more by your guys' reactions. My dad was a lumberjack with his own company. He was a real entrepreneur in that industry, and most of the logs and whatnot imported to the main city was from his neck of the woods, no pun intended. So we had quite a bit of money as I was growing up and lived in this beautiful, intricate mansion in the heart of the neighboring forest. We were miles out from any bordering residences, and so I came into myself kind of an introvert and one of those weird kids that develops a love for dancing in the rain or watching amphibious creatures do their thing for hours on end in the creek running directly through my backyard. Basically, what I'm saying is I found myself alone much of the time. This isn't anything against my parents for letting it be this way. I just preferred my haven of space. All right, sorry for the lengthy introduction. When I was about to start grade school, I knew that our house was special. My mother even said so, constantly. This house is a blessing. So I had a hero worship thing going on, and I never really wanted to leave. Never wanted to drive to the city to start kindergarten and socialize with kids who wouldn't comprehend my introspective reality. Mom told me I have to go, as I'm assuming most people would understandably tell their kids, but I wasn't having it at that age, and the night before I was supposed to start to school, I decided to run away. I took the new backpack that my mom had gotten me and stuffed it full of clothes and fruit snacks. Our house was so unnecessarily large that you could stomp about on the base floor without anyone hearing until they would be about halfway down the first flight of stairs. I took advantage of that and grabbed all the sugary stuff my mom wouldn't let me have more than once a day and let myself out the front door. I had made the choice to live with all the creatures that I watched on a daily, figuring they'd be the only ones who would understand me. As I walked deeper and deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to grow and tower over me the farther I went. And what made it worse was that seemed to have a noise cancellation effect. The hum of the woods and the slight sounds here and there of the animals seemed to completely die, and I was left with a disturbing, soft quiet. Even at 5, I knew something wasn't all right about this. I found a tree with a hive-like structure at its roots and nestled into that, laying my sole blanket over top of myself while I tried to sleep. In case you couldn't tell, that wasn't in the cards. After I'd been laying there for about 40 minutes, I started to relax enough to feel my eyes drooping. It had to be later than midnight at that point, but I can't say for certain. Anyhow, the noiseless environment actually began to comfort me into a sleep, and it was just when the dreams started to open in my head that I heard the first whisper. My eyes popped open. I held my breath, listening for that again. I was more surprised than anything else, really, especially because I had gone almost an hour in this wild silence. I didn't hear what it said, I just knew it was there, and that became a curiosity for me to sit up against the tree trunk and try to hear the voice again. "Come here," it said. I turned and realized it was coming from the tree. I scanned upwards until I see a glimmering whiteness of an eyeball staring at me. An abnormally large squirrel, maybe like the size of a house cat, hung by its tail over the branch, calmly smiling at me, with human teeth and human eyes. It opened its mouth and breathily spoke, "Come deeper, child." My breath hitched and I froze. The creature opened its paw and its long claws, like a foot long. Each of them reached down and grabbed the tree. It started to crawl towards me, painfully slow, and its eyes got wider with each inch it took towards me. Its calm before seemed to fade as an excitement was evoked with the increasing tempo of its eager pants, and that's when I found myself sprinting back home. I hadn't realized how far I had gone into the woods until I was fighting for breath with every lunge I took to return. I could be manufacturing this, but I swear I heard the deep clawing of earth following me, like that thing was chasing me with a speed it could only manage with those impossibly elongated talons. I burst through the threshold, and noise came about again. It was shocking, and I almost faltered in my run to lounge in the comfort of it, but I could see my front door, and I wasn't staying out there any longer. I skipped over the creek, where I took note of a strange collection of frogs sitting in a uniform line staring out into the woods, and slammed the front door behind me. My parents still weren't up. I looked out the window to see the frogs still in that line, and a figure in the distance, maybe where I had crossed that threshold, pacing like a wild, hungry predator. It was larger than the squirrel at the very least, but I could still see that bright white from those human eyes. And I don't know why I felt this way. Maybe it was intuition, maybe it was something else, but some part of me knew that those eyes were stolen. I didn't go to sleep that night, and I made a promise to myself I wouldn't go back into the woods. Not past the creek. I'm sorry that this was kind of short, but this was only my first memory, and I was so young, so everything is kind of patchy except for the truly traumatic parts. My next was when I was about 11. I'll leave it up to you guys if you want to hear more. I'm in college, so just know if I do post another one. It might not be right away, but I'll do my very best. Thank you guys for reading. Thanks a lot for watching the video. Till the end, subscribe to Horror in Detail for more videos. Drop your suggestions in comment section.